Hello fellas, this is your November Veterans Day Irish American History Report for AOH Division 32. I'm on the field at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where I've done a few history reports. But this time I want to tell a tragic tale of really someone who is a true Irish hero, an Irish patriot, but really an American traitor. Our story begins in County Derry in Ireland, where John Mitchel was born in 1815. He was the son of a Protestant minister, and he went to school at Trinity College Dublin, where he trained as a lawyer. He became the leading advocate at the time for Irish nationalism, Irish republicanism, in his newspapers, which were The Nation, which he was editor of, and The United Irishman, which he was the founder of. He was, as I say, a great advocate for Irish nationalism, but he was also one of the great proponents of pointing out the horrors of British policy towards Ireland during what became known as the Great Irish Famine. You may have heard it said that the Lord sent the potato blight, but the British made the famine. That is John Mitchel's wording from his newspaper. He was also a great proponent of the Irish language and Irish culture. As I said, he came from a Protestant background, and he saw that Gaelic culture, that history of the Irish nation, as a way to bring Protestants and Catholics together and build and forge a new Irish nation. Needless to say, this did not delight Queen Victoria and the British government at the time, and he got caught up in the Young Ireland Rebellion of 1848. He was sentenced to exile in Australia, like many of those leaders, and along with Thomas Francis Maher, who would later go on to command the Irish Brigade during the American Civil War, exiled to Tasmania. Both of them escaped, and Mitchel ended up moving to New York in the 1850s. This is where our story takes a little bit of a turn, because after a little while, his comrades in the Irish Republican movement and the Irish cause began to ask questions about John, saying John's gone a little strange. What had happened to John? Well, John all of a sudden became a very strong proponent of slavery. He became a very strong proponent of the Southern cause in the years leading up to the American Civil War. Now, as you all know, or most of you know, the American Civil War involved a lot of different issues, but the primary cause of it, of course, was slavery. And if you have any doubts about that, well, John Mitchel will set you straight, because he was very clear about what the causes of the war were. And he thought this was great. He was an absolute proponent of slavery. He was such a proponent of slavery that he actually moved first to Knoxville, Tennessee, and then with the outbreak of the American Civil War, he moved to Richmond, Virginia, where he edited a newspaper called the Richmond Inquirer. 3 of John's sons served in the Confederate Army during the American Civil War, including his youngest, 18-year-old Willie. And Willie Mitchel served with the 1st Virginia Regiment, which was part of Pickett's charge on the 3rd day of the Battle of Gettysburg, on this field behind me. This was the final assault for the Confederacy against the Northern United States Army, Union Army line. Willie Mitchel was carrying the colors for the 1st Virginia Regiment when he was shot and killed. But facing him that day was the 13th Vermont Regiment. And you see the memorial to the 13th Vermont in the picture right now. Interestingly, the 13th Vermont, Company A, was known as Emmett's Guards. If you remember last month's Irish History Report on Robert Emmet, it was named after Robert Emmet. It was a group of Irish immigrants who were organized by Captain John Lonergan from County Tipperary for the express purpose of creating an armed militia for the eventual freedom of Ireland. So John Mitchel, the great Irish patriot, son, was more than likely killed from a bullet from his fellow Irishman in the Emmet's Guards. Irishman against Irishman, American against American on the field at Gettysburg. Like I said, this is a tragic story. John Mitchel, after the war, after the Civil War, he lost another son serving in the Confederate Army. He became editor for a brief time of the New York Daily News and moved back north to New York. He was imprisoned because he was still very ardent in his defense of the Southern Confederacy and arguing that the South was in fact right during the war. Even making claims that Robert E. Lee wasn't sufficiently committed to the Confederate cause. Again, he was initially on the outs with his fellow Fenians, with his fellow Irish Republicans, most of whom the vast majority had fought for the United States and to preserve the Union. But eventually, John came back to advocating what he had originally advocated for, which was the freedom of Ireland. He returned to Ireland in the 1870s and ran for Parliament from County Tipperary. He was elected twice, and in the grand tradition of British parliamentary democracy, he was expelled both times because he had been a felon. This is the same move that the British did when Bobby Sands was elected from Parliament in 1981 as a hunger striker. When they don't like the way Ireland votes, they just make the Irish vote again. During that fight to be seated in the British Parliament, John died. He died at about 60 years of age, 1875, and was buried in Ireland. Now, the story of John Mitchel, his son Willie Mitchell, who fell on this field, of Captain John Lonergan, who won the Medal of Honor from County Tipperary, and then later went to fight for Irish freedom in the Fenian raids on Canada, show how the American Civil War was brother against brother, but also comrade against comrade for Irish nationalists and Irish Republicans. It also shows how people can be very, very right in one context and heroes in one context, and can fail in other contexts, as sadly the tragic story of John Mitchel shows. Patrick Pearse, again, leader of the 1916 Rising, called him an apostle for Irish republicanism. And he was, and he should be recognized for that. And he made great contributions, and his writings on bringing Protestants and Catholics together in the cause of the Irish nation is still very relevant today. On the other hand, we cannot forget his terrible, terrible judgment when it came to the rights of other human beings and African Americans and his defenses of slavery. So John Mitchell teaches us that lesson that people can be right in some things, wrong on other things, and that we always need to keep in mind when we're advocating for freedom and liberty that other people also have claims on freedom and liberty too. So that is your November AOH Division 32 history report from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And hopefully I will see you all very soon. Slán.